Welcome everyone. My name is Sana Nakada for those who don't know me, and, with Rachel Fensham and the Digital Studio, as co-director of the Indigenous Settler Relations Collaboration, have hosted this incredibly generative and exciting seminar series on Indigenous Australians and digital futures. Today is our last seminar. But before I introduce Dr. Rose to you all, I'd like to acknowledge that we host this seminar series, and for myself and Rachel and James, we do all of our work here at the University of Melbourne on Wurundjeri country. We're meeting here today in what is known as National Reconciliation Week. I know it's been a busy week of events and what should have been some uncomfortable and challenging conversations about what reconciliation is and who it's for and who wants it. We're not having that conversation here today, but I'd like to say that we have those conversations also in the context of working within an institution that stands on stolen land. On that note, please let me introduce Dr. James Rose, who's here from the Indigenous Data Network, which has been established at the University of Melbourne with the leadership of Associate Provost Marcia Langton, and is part of the Indigenous Studies Unit at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. James is Senior Research Fellow and has been brought in to establish and lead and get this Indigenous Data Network up and running, which is no small feat, as you will hear. He's trained as a forensic social anthropologist, specialising in Indigenous population dynamics, social and kinship analysis and geographical information systems, as well as research data management. So it's obvious why he's been brought to the University of Melbourne to do this work. It's exceptionally challenging. It's taking place in what I think is a really challenging moment institutionally and across academia as we attempt to grapple with vast volumes of data already produced, with the ethics and protocols for continuing to produce new forms of data and information. And as James will speak to today, for beginning to rethink what it means to have community control over what is best understood as an intangible asset. So I'm going to leave James with you for about the next 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to have a bit of a conversation.
I think that's the right way to do it. Yeah, I'll present for about 20 minutes, and then if we break down to a bit more of a dialogue type situation, it'll give everyone the chance to, flesh out some of the things that I might have skated over.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that there's time for some questions and answers after that as well. Okay, thanks, James.
Great, thanks, Sana. Let me re-emphasise for my own purposes the thanks to the Wurundjeri Nation for having made the tremendous sacrifice that allows us all to be here today. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about this, but really all of the wealth that you see around you today in material terms is derived from the wealth that was taken from Wurundjeri people. Okay, and we're going to really work out how data sits within that process of wealth appropriation or alienation today. So as Sana said, I work within the Indigenous Studies Unit, which is headed by Vice Provost Professor Marcia Langton. We are inside the Melbourne School of Population Health, which is the Faculty of Medicine. So it's wonderful to be here at the invitation of Digital Studios, because we think that the relationship between the humanities and social sciences and the so-called natural sciences and the more formal disciplines that tend to be associated with work on data is critical to this kind of a project, which is of a national scale and really has global applications, if we can set a good example here in Australia. So the title of this presentation is the Indigenous Data Network, Restoring Community Control over an Intangible Asset. Please feel free to follow us on Twitter if you have a Twitter account. In order to work through what is a quite complicated series of interlinked ideas, I like to start my seminars by spelling out the motivation, goal, and strategy that we're applying in the discussion. So the motivation here is a real material inequality in the degree of control over data, Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in this country. It's material because it has tangible consequences for Indigenous people, many of which you might have heard about in the media around the recent release of the Closing the Gap report, which talks about differences in incarceration rates, life expectancies, child mortality, and various other very serious, very concrete disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. The specific goal that we have with the Indigenous Data Network is to build a national federated Indigenous-controlled entity for managing the way that data is applied to resolving that inequality in this country. And I'm going to drill right down into how we think that should be done. But just before we start off, we are really talking about a data protection authority for handling the holding, controlling and processing of Indigenous data as a distinct class of intangible asset that is the property of Indigenous people in this country. It's a very, very complicated exercise. So the priority is to build a coherent national conversation that centres around agreed terms and definitions. And that's really what I'm going to be focusing on here. So we're talking about data, control, and a colonial economy, and I'm going to work my way through what each of those terms means in this context. So what is data in the first instance? Data is what we call a semogenic product in semiotic, in linguistic terms. So it's the tertiary product of a sequence of classes of work, if you like, which begins with human experience. Okay, so human experience is premised on a repertoire of abilities that all human beings have: sight, sound, touch, and the other senses. And these are mechanisms that allow us to convert what are electromagnetic and other physical changes in our environment into electrical signals that our brain can process. Okay, it sounds very cut and dry, but it's important that we just get that out of the way first. What happens after we do something like detect a change in air pressure as wind, or a change in electrical field as touch on our nerve cells, and by wind I mean, of course, hearing, or changes in certain parts of the light spectrum that reach our eyes as sight, is that our brain kicks in and begins turning that into structured information. What makes humans so successful evolutionarily is that we have the capacity for very, very complex language, symbolic systems. So all languages have universal traits, but underpinning all of them is the power to make meaning, right, out of that physical experience. So we take all of those sensory perceptions and we generate meaning. The fuel, if you like, or the currency of meaning is information. So what happens as we move through our lives, socializing with different parts of our communities, is that we begin to specialize different branches of language to talk about different realms of experience. So we have specialized languages for talking about, for example, religion. We have specialized language for talking about music. We have specialized language for talking about relationships, and so on and so forth. Over the course of our respective cultural revolutions, we've specialized those languages to the points where we're now able to reproduce those very sorts of expertise, expert ways of talking in the academy. So we now have, departments that specialize in social science and departments that specialize in IT and so on and so forth. But where does data come into it? Data is an even more distilled form of meaning, which is based on the classification of characteristic attributes within each domain of specialized language. So if we take, for example, a social science language, data that is relevant to social science has to do with things like relationships, the way people interact with each other, the frequency with which people interact with each other under certain conditions. And the result, or the consequence of being able to identify and agree on characteristic attributes for different domains of meaning, different forms of specialized language, is that we can count them. So we turn what is otherwise a very organic and fluid way of understanding the world, which is reflected in art, music, and poetry, into something that can be counted. And this is what data does. Data is countable, characteristic attributes derived from distinctions between specialized forms of language. The most important thing is that it's all the product of intellectual work. Being the product of intellectual work means that data has value. It has financial value, because as we know, anything we can count, we can put a dollar figure on. And this really became undeniable with the emergence of the data economy with Web 2.0. Web 2.0 is different from Web 1 because it depends upon active participant engagement or active user engagement. Web version 1 was really just a bunch of websites with people looking at them and reading them. Web 2.0 is Facebook, Twitter, interactive platforms where the data itself is actually being generated by the user in a couple of different ways, either just passive exposure in terms of advertising exposure, or by volunteering information about themselves, right? In 2011, the World Economic Forum addressed this issue. It defined data as the product of intellectual work, and therefore as an asset class on par with tangible assets such as capital, tangible infrastructure, and most importantly, real estate. And I'll explain why that's the most important variety of tangible asset in a minute. And around about the same time, the International Accounting Standards Board and the IFRS also began to consolidate their formal definitions of intangible assets as having measurable financial value. Then around about this time, 12 months ago, the European Union introduced the General Data Protection Regulation, which compels Web 2.0 entities operating within the EU's jurisdiction to establish data asset registries. So finally biting the bullet and saying, yes, we are collecting this stuff that has value. Yes, it does belong to the people who use our platforms. Yes, we make a lot of money out of this. Is another example. So the GDPR regulates organizations that hold, control, and process personal data, but by extrapolation, any data that is generated by people interacting with platforms that perform those functions. So under the GDPR, each EU member state maintains a data protection authority, which is sort of like an ombudsman service. You can report breaches of the GDPR to the DPA in your country, and they will investigate and report on that breach, make a finding, and they can enforce compliance if necessary where there have been breaches. Now that's the European Union, which Australia is not a member of. Okay, damn. Okay, what is a colonial economy? So Australia, in common with New Zealand and Canada and the US, South Africa and a couple of other countries, has an economy which is built on whole-scale unilateral asset transfer. Okay, it's a huge free kick for starting a national economy. Okay, it's land. Okay, so the entire land mass of Australia was transferred to Britain in the blink of an eye, along with all the natural resources contained within that land mass. It was a phenomenal cash injection for Britain. That was Indigenous property. Okay, and we are still only just now in the 21st century coming to terms with what that involved, the scale of it. Many people in this country, in government and policy development, still can't quite wrap their heads around what that entailed. So when I started the presentation by sort of saying that everything that you see around you, including this wonderful campus and this wonderful city, all of the wealth that we see around us, is all derived from that initial act of theft. And that's not an outrageous proposition. It's just what happened. It's just a matter of fact. Okay. So when Australia was federated, and very slowly through a series of pieces of legislation in the 1930s, subsequently then finally in the 1980s, Britain withdrew its stake in the economy, and the Commonwealth of Australia took over managing that stolen property. Okay. So where does the alienation of data fit into that process? It's staged, it was staggered over the rollout of the colonial project in Australia. So in the first instance, as I mentioned before, first of all, land and natural resources were alienated from Indigenous access, also use and distribution, because of course what an economy does ultimately is distribute, right, resources around a human population for efficient use. That's what economies are, the distribution frameworks, okay, wealth distribution frameworks. So by seizing the Australian land mass and alienating Indigenous people from access to and use of those resources, Britain basically subsumed the Indigenous economy within the British one. Once they'd alienated the land and natural resources, they began alienating Indigenous labour. So where it was very difficult to allocate non-Indigenous labour to particular applications, particularly in remote areas, they would use local labour forces. They did that via a process which is now euphemistically referred to as the use of stolen wages. In other parts of the world, we call it slavery. Okay? Yes, Australia had slavery. We just call it stolen wages. And then as the colonial economy became more sophisticated, more organised, and particularly when it transferred to being locally managed by governments based here, information became an integral part of extracting value from those resources. So we talk about information describing the location and distribution of natural resources, but particularly we talk about specialised administrative languages. So I started off before talking about specialised languages for talking about social science, music, religion, and so forth. Colonial administration is a specialised domain, a specialised field of meaning in its own right. And various bits of legislation were passed in different jurisdictions within Australia, working with common principles around the best way to administer a colony. And as a result, they produced a field of specialised knowledge called anthropology. Okay, social anthropology is a colonial administrative discourse for managing stolen land and resources and stolen labour. That's what anthropology is. And I say that as a social anthropologist myself. Okay. It's again, it's not a contentious proposition, it's just a fact. Now, what has Australia done subsequently to deal with this issue of data, appropriated data? And I skipped a bit. Indigenous data are those characteristic attributes of the specialised language of administration that control Indigenous labour and Indigenous people that gives rise to quantitative outputs, right? So when you have a specialised language for talking about Indigenous populations, Indigenous languages, Indigenous economies, and so on and so forth, Indigenous religion, you're generating data, tons and tons of data about people that had no say in, you know, the governance or the transfer of that data to the colonial authority. Okay. So Australia, you know, as I alluded to in the beginning, has just given no thought to that, because this whole question of Australia's origins is largely still unaddressed and still very, very contentious, which is interesting in and of itself. What Australia does have is the 1988 Privacy Act, the 2013 Privacy Regulation, and then the amendments from 2017. But those all are really only oriented towards individual privacy concerns. So things like your name, your age, your sexual identity, your income, things like that. You know, very, very unique, decontextualized things that are universal in their application. It's not at all tailored to Australia as a distinct case in the global data economy, as a colonial economy. So what is control, and what do we mean when we talk about restoring Indigenous control to Indigenous data under those circumstances? First of all, we're talking about acknowledging that data that relates to Indigenous people is a discrete class in and of itself. So within the class of asset that is intangible assets, we're talking about an even more specific class. And what makes it more specific, what makes it distinct, is that it's the property of a people who never consented to it in the first instance, never consented to it being collected. And we're talking about data that's been collected pretty much since the late 18th century. So there's a huge quantity of financially valuable information. We can, more or less estimate what it's worth in dollar terms using instruments that have been developed by the International Accounting Board and so on. And it's just sitting there, and it's sitting there in libraries and museums and archives. That's the historical data. But then it continues to be collected by government agencies without any specific regard to the distinctive issues that apply in this country. There is a precedent for recognising distinct Indigenous property rights in this country, which is the Native Title Act. It's not very well administered. The compromise that was made when it was introduced was that it would be contested in a court setting. So it had to be litigated in order to be proven. So it's very, very inefficient, costs a huge amount of money, takes a very, very long time. Central coordination of how that's done. So there are no national standards on how it's done. But there is a precedent, conceptually, in law and in cultural attitudes, because native title once also was contentious, is no longer contentious. What we're trying to do at the Indigenous Studies Unit is to build up the architecture for a federated model of data control that will provide an efficient mechanism, unlike native title, for integration of standardized terms, definitions, attitudes, and governance arrangements that will facilitate access and control. So the holding, processing, and control of Indigenous data specifically. And the reason that I referred to data protection authorities in the beginning, and they're wrong under the GDPR in the EU, is that there is real scope for an entity like the Indigenous Data Network to perform similar kinds of functions, but for Indigenous communities specifically. And that's what we're working towards. So I'd like to throw back to Sana. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, James. Take a seat. Little stage change, hey?
Can I grab that water?
Thank you. Really fascinating, powerful, transformative, difficult work. I have a few questions. I know others will have questions as well, but I might just kick off by moving in a few different directions. But I might start with something we talked briefly about before, because we had, as part of this series, scheduled Professor Maggie Walter to come and chat about her work and her project around Indigenous data sovereignty, which we're looking to reschedule. So I just wondered, for the sake of this audience and people who've been engaged in this seminar series, how a national Indigenous data network relates to or bounces off the work she's done as a sociologist.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So Indigenous data sovereignty is an international movement, really in the Anglosphere. So it's a united movement. There's a lot of cross-pollination, a lot of collaboration between groups in the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. The genesis for the Indigenous Data Network was a symposium that was organised by the Indigenous Studies Unit by Professor Langton here at the university in 2017, and it was called Indigenous Data Sovereignty. The reason that we are now tailoring our language a little bit more is because there are two distinct tasks within the movement internationally. And one of them is to build awareness and consciousness and to help promulgate the idea and understanding of Indigenous data sovereignty at a conceptual and theoretical level. And the other task is very, very practical and technical and legal and a little bit less interesting. So that's how we see ourselves cooperating with Professor Walter and others that are collaborating with her. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really rich relationship to think about the ways in which Professor Walter's work challenges us, particularly within the academy, to think about how we work with the data that exists and the ethics of producing data. The Indigenous Data Network strikes me as something that's much more about how to give all of that a value and a regulatory framework to prevent the forms of exploitation and theft that have been long-standing and are ongoing. So thank you for that. I want to come back to this relationship a little bit around the language of stolen, which I don't think is contentious. I'm not going to treat it as contentious here, but I think it's a really interesting thing to think about how well accepted it is, well, in some parts of the Australian community that we live on stolen land, that we have had extensive work and efforts put into understanding stolen wages and slavery in this country. How do people respond to the idea of stolen knowledge? Yeah, look,
it's very difficult at an emotional level for people who do understand the concept of theft in their personal day-to-day lives to extrapolate that out to their whole sense of a national identity. And particularly for Anglos, such as myself, who have a real, I guess, emotional stake in this country because they have no other real nationality besides this one. It is particularly difficult to acknowledge that your identity is based on a crime, a genocidal crime. And, for some of us, Anglos, it's not such a big deal. We can say, well, look, this has happened in other parts of the world. We can wrap our heads around the magnitude of that event in a global sense. We learned about World War II. We've learned about the misdeeds of the British Empire in other parts of the world. So we can what's the word? Assimilate that concept, if you like. But then there are those of us, and I include in this characterization members of my own family, who are, I should say actually, I'm a second generation migrant. My mother was born in South Africa. My father is descended partly from convicts. So I've got sort of a migrant aspect on the one hand, but a migrant aspect that is Anglo from another colony, and a much more violent one, one where things, took a different path. And so I can say that members of my family still are very, very uncomfortable and can't assimilate the idea that their national identity is based on a crime. And this is partly a psychological issue, it's partly a cultural issue, and it's just going to require, more work, more time.
And I think the practical, technical, legal ends of this creates a space in which there's work to be done on the psychology of a nation, and then there's actually just work that needs to be done, whether the psychology of the nation shifts or not. My last sort of question before we throw it open to discussion is, as people sitting mostly in this audience, within a university context in which we are every day producing, our job is to produce new knowledge. How does this change the way we think about what new knowledge is?
Right.
That's a big question. A more precise question I have is thinking about the relationship of qualitative to quantitative data in this. And I'm thinking of the kind of qualitative knowledge that Indigenous peoples give constantly, but in ways that are not well counted, that don't come to produce big data sets that can be measured. And I guess I'm just interested on your own reflections as someone who's come to the university and sits in that space around what it means to produce new knowledge in this context, in a context of appreciating stolen knowledge, and in the context of the sort of different kinds of knowledge that perhaps are more challenging to capture within this data framework.
Fantastic. So there's probably two threads in that, at least.
So that was me trying to get 4 questions into 3. I just stealing them from
I'll start with 2, and then when I've spoken too much, you can cut me off and refocus. So I come from, before I came down to the university, I worked for 13 years as a forensic social anthropologist in the native title sector. So I worked for an Aboriginal controlled law firm in Redfern in Sydney for 13 years. My role there was to basically build evidence that was sufficient to be able to prosecute land rights claims in the federal court. So I was responsible for putting together the evidence for native title claims. And what we found was that there was an incredible amount of evidence out there, but that it was really only functional in a court setting if it took a particular form. And one of the first things that was said to me when I began working on the northwest slopes and plains around Moree, Brewarrina and those kinds of places was that, look, why should we, as Kamilaroi people, have to conform with the expectations of what is effectively, a foreign power, the instruments of a foreign power, in order even to assert our rights under that foreign power? And that sort of set me thinking, well, okay, not only is that a really, really good question, but there's probably an answer to it. And what we found out was that, first of all, it wasn't very difficult to translate the aggregate knowledge of entire communities and cultures into that form. It wasn't a compromise, really. What was missing was a kind of enshrining, if you like, of the production chain, as I described earlier on in the presentation, between the Indigenous knowledge, which is sometimes, characterized as qualitative exclusively. I wouldn't say necessarily it's always qualitative. We have Indigenous astronomy, we have Indigenous mathematics. It exists, it's a thing, it's real. It doesn't take very much processing to turn it into a format where barristers and solicitors and federal court judges can say, actually, that's very compelling. And that's how I wound up down here in the medical faculty, because it turns out that processing is really useful to a whole bunch of other applications, population health specifically. But during that production process, that processing, chain, if you like, the key was to keep the owners of the data completely involved the whole time and figure out how to generate lateral products that were useful to them in their communities day to day. So one of the first things that people were saying to us was like, look, you guys are sitting back there in Redfern collecting tons and tons of old welfare board records, birth, death and marriage certificates, all of this incredibly precious stuff that we can never access. And we said, okay, well, let's figure out a way to make this accessible. So we built a cloud-based sort of repository that was very, very easy to run searches on, extract data that was relevant to people's ancestors, package it up and send it out to them on request. So, 30 to 50% of the time that I and my colleagues were working, we were packaging up data sets to send back out to people who were contributing towards the native title claim evidence-making process. That's an example.
Yeah.
There are lots of other ways that you can do it depending on what the application is.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to throw it open. Before I do that, just for the sake of, because we don't live stream the question and answers so that everyone can feel comfortable asking whatever they like, and because the audio doesn't pick it up that well anyway. So just for the sake of everyone at home, I'm going to thank James.
Thanks,
Thank
Anna.
you so much for your presentation and for answering those questions. I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot the last couple of days about the Indigenous Data Network, and I think everyone in the university has quite a bit of work to do in thinking through the ways in which we fit into the kind of transformation that this is going to produce. So thank you for your time.
No, thank you.